Great. Greetings to you all, and thank you for joining us today on this 18 May, which is an HIV Vaccine Awareness Day. Some call it World AIDS Vaccine Day. We are really happy that you all were able to take time to really join us as part of this conversation. And just a little bit and maybe some history on this day, that this is a day that is globally marked to spread awareness about the importance of developing an HIV vaccine for HIV prevention. Actually, this day was first observed on the 18th of May in 1998. This was a year later after the then US President Bill Clinton declared that only a truly effective preventive HIV vaccine can limit and eventually end the threat of AIDS. So this Awareness Day is also an opportunity just to remind us, as well as talk about where we are with regards to the search of an HIV vaccine. But I think most importantly, because as the region, in particular Africa, we have had a whole lot of teams who have really come together, partnered, collaborated to really make sure that we find an HIV vaccine day. So this as well, I think it is an opportunity to recognize all of the role players who have and continue to give their time to the search of an HIV vaccine. And these include, but are not limited to, communities, very important, and the participants from which the communities are coming from, research teams and scientists, funding organizations who really put in the money to make sure that the search for an HIV vaccine continues, as well as governments who also support in different ways, as well as fund research, and many more who advocate for the search to find this HIV vaccine that is much needed. And I believe, and I hope that we all believe actually that it is one of the tools that we need. But today we have brought together one of the scientists and an advocate who are doing just that, advocating and working tirelessly in the search for a vaccine against HIV. So as you know, we today have Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, who is the director of the Desmond Tutu HIV Center at the Institute of Infectious Diseases and Molecular Medicine at the University of Cape Town. She is also the Chief Executive Officer of the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation. She's an A-rated physician, scientist, and infectious disease specialist whose research interests include clinical and programmatic research around HIV and TB treatment. And of course, today, COVID-19, and as well as prevention of HIV, in particular, women, youth, and men who have sex with men. She also led numerous HIV and COVID-19 vaccine trials and co-leads the well-known Sisonke phase 3B study in South Africa. Now, for each of them, we're going to hear something that is fun about them. And about Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, one of my favorite fun facts is that she earlier, as a young person, when she was contemplating which doctor she wants to be, she wanted to be, I hope I'm able to say this, a geriatrician. And I believe this is a specialization area of providing healthcare to the elderly. So LGB, though, somehow was convinced to really come into HIV as well as TB and other infectious diseases like COVID today. So we're happy that we have her because she really has a lot to share with us, and hopefully she might reconsider when going to retire to go back to her initial interest. And then Maureen Luba is from Malawi, but is currently in the United States, where she is currently studying for a master's degree in global health delivery at Harvard Medical School. And we really appreciate that, Maureen, because I think your studies in global health delivery really will come in handy, especially for Africa. So we're really happy to the extent which you really wanted to go to make sure that all products, and probably even preparing for an HIV vaccine when we find it. Otherwise, Maureen is a senior program manager at AVAC. She has worked in HIV in the context of prevention and sexual and reproductive health and rights advocacy. She's passionate about vaccine R&D and strongly believes that an effective vaccine is within reach. I think we really need that encouragement. Now, a fun fact about Maureen is that she loves seafood too much. She actually says she loves it to an extent that she would have it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a daily basis. But one of the things that I know about Maureen is that she is actually a farmer. I know that she can't wait to go back to Malawi to also do her farming work. Anyway, let us not waste any more time. We will hand over to LGB and Maureen to tell us where an HIV vaccine is in 2022. This is years since the very first HIV vaccine trial, we are told, in the US was in 1987. Then years later, the first African country to conduct a trial is Uganda. So as usual, please feel free. This is a conversation about all of us. Use the chat box as they are speaking to register your question, your comments. And once they are done, we'll open the line for all of us to be heard and to really interact on this subject today. And in fact, later we will be sharing with you about another series that is hosted by AVAC on the same commemoration of HIV Vaccine Day. Over to you, LGB. Where is an HIV vaccine?
Thanks, Ntando, and great pleasure to join both you and my very good friend Maureen as we contemplate this for the next 45 minutes or so. And I just bring everyone up to date. That's really what I wanted to do. And of course, we have been living with this particular pathogen, that of the human immunodeficiency virus, now for 40 years. So an extraordinary global epidemic that has had profound impact on our globe over the last 40 years. And it is true, we still have no HIV vaccine. So as you rightly report, we first discovered HIV in about 81, 82. It was, we saw the first reports in 81, it was discovered in 83. We had the first treatment in 87. We've got wonderful prevention, I'll come back to in a moment now, available to us. But we are still looking for the vaccine. And in contrast, if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, we had the first reports of COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 in 2020. And of course, I'm hoping everybody on this call has been at least vaccinated and or boosted with a COVID vaccine as soon as just 2 years later. So an extraordinary contrast, and we're going to unpack a little bit about this. However, the need for an HIV vaccine still looms large. And of course, we missed major prevention gaps, goals in 2020. It was said by UNAIDS that too many countries have failed to put in place the combination of structural, behavioral, and biomedical approaches to have a lasting impact. And of course, chief amongst, and COVID-19 had its own role in setting these goals back around HIV, but chief among the prevention strategies that we need, the biomedical prevention strategies, is the hope of a vaccine. And with almost 2 million new infections in 2020, we really do need to bring the whole basket of prevention options to bear around the world in order to make a difference. But I am going to spend the next few minutes just bringing you up to date with where we are in vaccines within this array. And I think it's really important to note, we're not saying this is the only option. There are already wonderful options of prevention out there. But the extraordinary thing about a vaccine is it is a very, very important and it's a cornerstone, particularly of viral infection control, because it provides hopefully long-lasting protection. It can be delivered through existing infrastructure. It often overcomes social stigma, behavior needs, and the need for adherence, and it protects all people at risk of HIV infection, including those most vulnerable, and has the promise to provide herd immunity down the pike as well. Now, to date, the way we've approached this is, on the one hand, through a number of different kinds of platforms, we've gone in either with an empirical or inductive approach, which is where we say, let's dream up a candidate think what is our best option of a candidate, and then put it into a R&D program, phase 1, phase 2, leading into phase 3. We then look for correlates if we see a signal, and we optimize the regimen. That has been the way we have done things for the last 30 years. However, I'll point out why the world has now shifted to say maybe we should move to a second kind of approach, which is the more theoretical or deductive approach, where we say, let's determine the immune correlates. Let's think where we want to go and then work backwards and actually say, how do we design vaccines that are going to induce those immune correlates down the pike? So a different approach, and I'll bring examples of both. So let's first go to the first indication that the empirical approach might work, but sadly to date has been the last. And this was, of course, the very famous Thai trial, RV144, now read out in 2009. It's a long time ago. But this study of 2 vaccines, AVAC, with the AIDS Vax GP120, this showed a 61% reduction of HIV incidence after 1 year, but only a 31% reduction of incidence after the study was completed at 3 years. So insufficient to say we need to commercialize this, but sufficient to say, let's do the correlates of protection assessment. And so although there was a waning of protection, a real effort went in to say, what are the correlates? What is the indication? What part of the immune system was important that was revved up by this vaccine that we can emulate in other programs? And we moved quickly to take those learnings and design this program, which became known as the P5 program. And of course, the keystone trial here was the UHAMBO HVTN 702 study to say, can we take the RV144 concept, apply it in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, and get an incidence reduction as well. And unfortunately, as you all know, the study was stopped just before we went into the COVID pandemic because we did not see the kind of response that had been seen even in RV144. So really flat, no change. And so our DSMB halted the study on the basis of futility. Now, just after UHAMBO got into the field, this research program started. So another empirical research program called J&J. It is based on the AD26 platform. As you all know, the J&J COVID vaccine is similarly on this platform. It's a viral vector. It included a mosaic, which allowed it to have very broad coverage in terms of clade and in terms of the kinds of immunogens we want, the types of viruses that would occur around the world. And so had great hope really for having an impact not only in the northern part of the globe, but also the southern part of the globe. And this, you see the various parts of the vaccine regimen here, the AD26 MVA, plus this GAG pole envelope with a clade C GP120. So very exciting vaccine. We first put it into a study of women who have sex with men. This was known as Umbakodo, led by Glenda Gray, Susan Buchbinder, Kathy Mgadi, and Frank Tamaka from J&J. And this involved 2,600 women and was structured to have a first phase where we would look to see is the vaccine good before moving into a second phase. And in about mid-year of last year, the DSMB looked to see whether the study could possibly move into the second phase. In other words, had it met criteria to continue development. And sadly, the outcome here was that in the per protocol assessment, this vaccine did not make a difference. So although there was a little bit of vaccine effectiveness, 25%, this was not considered statistically to be significant, and that in fact this regimen did not protect young women from HIV acquisition. The correlate study is still ongoing. It is a safe vaccine, and importantly, its brother study, Mosaico, which is evaluating a similar kind of strategy, but a different set of immunogens in MSM and transgender populations, is still underway. So this is what this study looks like, and it's important for you to know it is still in the field, and we are hoping to see a readout of that in the next couple of years. Here is the third efficacy trial that has been conducted since RV144, an exciting trial also still in the field. So this one says, can we combine other kinds of prevention, namely PrEP, with a vaccine strategy? And so you see two vaccine types with a DNA and an envelope with the MVA, and two PrEP regimens, one with FTAF, the other with TDF, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and this very interesting multi-arm, multi-stage trial is still underway, and we have great hope for it as well. So here you see, in terms of ongoing efficacy trials since RV144, we've unfortunately lost both Uhambo and Imbokodo. We still have Mosaico and PrEP-Vac in the field. Let's move then to the theoretical or deductive approach, because what the world has now said is seemingly we need to go back to the bench, back to the lab, and say, we've got to handle that broadly neutralizing antibodies are absolutely key and critical here. Let's see if we can design the vaccine by working backwards. And that's exactly what this describes, is there are various ways to say, how do we elicit broadly neutralizing antibodies over time? And this work is well underway in a series of wonderful experiments, experimental medicine, to really go in with small studies and say, can we unpack the immunogenicity required here in order to find a vaccine that will work? So one method is to use these germline targeting approaches. And what the various sort of strategies are trying to do is encourage our own host immunity to make these broadly neutralizing antibodies by, if you like, giving it nudges with vaccines along the way. So you nudge the immune system in the direction you want it to go in order to get a mature broadly neutralizing antibody that we know is going to do the job. And so very exciting field of medicine, and is currently underway in our labs. Now I want to point out that we've used various HIV approaches to make the COVID vaccines. I've already alluded to AD26, but there've been AD25 vaccines used, chimp adenos, of course, antibodies, DNA, all to make the COVID-19 vaccines. But one that has been highly successful has, of course, been the new mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, to name just a few. This is now going a full circle in that this has provided impetus to bring this technology back to HIV. And we hear of the first HIV trimer mRNA vaccines going into clinical trials. And the wonderful thing about mRNA vaccines are they are quite easy to make, and that's said in inverted commas, but much easier than the sort of viral vector vaccine. So they can be manipulated quite quickly. And as you know, it took us literally 11 months to get an mRNA vaccine from the point of knowing what the genotype of the pathogen was all the way through to having a vaccine under emergency licensure. So this is a very exciting way of doing things. And what we can tell you is that there are at least 5 mRNA HIV vaccines going into 2 clinical trials, testing different strategies, even as we speak. And very exciting, I can even tell you today, 2 of those sites in Africa are starting indeed with the IRV scripts setup. So really exciting field, and watch this space. Early days, but great promise. Now I'm going to say 2 words about the other way we can bring vaccines to people, and this is through passive transfer of immunogens. And here we talk about broadly neutralizing antibodies. And all of you will remember that at the last R4P, there was a lot of conversation about these two studies called the antibody-mediated prevention studies. These studies showed that if you take a monoclonal antibody such as VRC01, and this is the first one that we've been talking about, and you transfer it via an intravenous line into people, that this study showed that you can be protected against HIV acquisition. The problem is that the circulating virus that it comes to the individual needs to match up perfectly with the monoclonal antibody. And in AMP, unfortunately, the matching wasn't brilliant, so we didn't get overall effect. But we know in those individuals where the antibody matched, we had protection and there was sensitivity. So we now know we have a range of very exciting neutralizing antibodies, including VRC01. These are being put together in combination, in duets, in triplets, and various studies are being devised and are actually getting into the field now to say, can we take this aspect of immunization forward? And here, this diagram just shows you that these antibodies have varying potency and breadth. So we can put them together and come up with what we think is the best cocktail in order to protect people. And again, thanks to AVAC for amassing this data for us, keeping us up to date about what is in and what is out of trials. So to sum up, Ntando, just before I hand over to Maureen, this is where we are. We have lost a number of very important efficacy trials. Sadly, most recently, also 705, but we hang on to the promise of RV144 that this is possible. We have the AMP trial, which shows us also that we can passively transfer. And I'll remind you, we've got 706 and PrEP both in the field at the moment. The pipeline further up is rich. So besides these non-neutralizing types of responses, we also know that we need to remember the broadly T response. I haven't even spoken about the viral vectors such as CMV and VSV, which are very exciting. And then in this yellow section, this very exciting new germline targeting approach using mRNA as a backdrop. So it's an exciting time to be in prevention discovery. We've got all the ARV-based prevention happening, but we've got some real science happening in terms of finding vaccines through this more inductive approach. And many questions still remain, but I think we're in good shape to say, let's answer these questions systematically and get to where we know we are going to have, in addition to the prevention superheroes that we have around ARV-based prevention, we also have a vaccine to offer to the world. And I'll stop there, acknowledge numbers of people. I will add to what Ntando's already said. We cannot have done any of this without the communities, the participants, and the research staff who've made such a brilliant contribution to date. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, LGB, for really that great summary of the road that has been traveled, and in fact, the road that is still promising, that still has to be traveled. And we'd like to again welcome everybody to this webinar today that is really asking a question of where is an HIV vaccine in 2022? And Professor Linda-Gail Bekker has really done a great job in really taking us through what has happened and what is actually happening. So please feel free, as we can see a lot of you are introducing you. We're coming from all over the region in Africa and as well in other parts of the world. We are really happy that you were able to join us today. And we are going to just move on and hand over to Maureen, Luba. But I think we wanted to also really thank all of the partners of the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, as well as advocates for prevention of HIV in Africa, and all of the partners who have really made this possible. And it actually speaks to the partnership that is needed in order for us to be able to continue fighting, as we have seen the picture that LGB has given us about the road that has to be traveled in order for us to really get to finding an HIV vaccine. I will at this point hand over to you, Maureen, and also please continue to feel free to ask questions. You might have heard a lot of terms, and this is the platform today to make sure that you have those terms that you don't understand answered. You might have heard about vectors, about antibodies that are monoclonal or broadly neutralizing. You heard about mRNA and many other phrases that might not be familiar to you in order, and this platform is exactly for that, in order for us to be able to really engage and understand and actually be part of the journey into the search of an HIV vaccine. Maureen, Luba, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ntando. So I don't have slides. And again, thanks to Linda for providing that rich and comprehensive summary of where we're coming from with HIV vaccine field, the current status, but also what the future looks like. So I would just emphasize on some of the critical points which Linda highlighted in her presentation. And first, of course, is that the emphasis that the need for an HIV vaccine is even greater as it has ever been felt. I think you just heard from Linda-Gail Bekker that now is actually an exciting moment in the HIV prevention field with lots of promising opportunities, for us to propel the field even further. And I think the fact that all of us are here today on this webinar, just to reflect on where we're coming from and what it will take, for us to get to an effective HIV vaccine in whatever form it's going to be, it means that it actually attests to the fact that HIV vaccine, it still remains an important public health intervention. So we know that, of course, it's been a rough ride with a few disappointing results, as you saw from the slides that Linda presented. But even with that, we know that now is not yet the time for us to give up. If anything, now is even the time for us to press even harder on the gas pedal. Our only way out of this is going to be, it has to be with a vaccine, right? In whatever form it's going to be, whether it's going to be an oral vaccine, but we just need to keep moving and use whatever resources and opportunities that we have for us to find that vaccine. I mean, after years and decades of HIV vaccine research, even with setbacks, there are, of course, a lot of there's a lot that we have actually learned from the HIV vaccine research field today. There's a lot we have learned in terms of trial designs, in terms of the candidates themselves, in terms of like the immune response, what it would take, to elicit that in long-term immune response. So there's a lot that we have learned. And I think as we enter into what I call a new phase, of HIV vaccine research, it's important for us, to pause and reflect on those, key important lessons. I call it a new phase for a couple of reasons. I heard from Linda-Gail Bekker that now we are moving from this inductive approach to deductive, right? We are moving from, doing more of empirical trials, but now being deductive and reflecting on what we have already done and drawing some lessons there, to again advance the field. I mean, as the search for HIV vaccine, gets even more complex, the field needs more innovative approaches to answer the remaining scientific questions. And I think most importantly, what we need is a more coordinated strategy among the different players, stakeholders, communities, researchers, industry, funders, donors, for us to unlock the remaining questions. Of course, after facing a few disappointing results, like I said, with a few key trials being stopped for non-efficacy, I think we could see, from the Linda-Gail Bekker's presentation, we can still tell that, there's still a glimmer of hope, right, with the at least 2 empirical trials still in the field, but also what I would call the emerging field with some clinical trials with mRNA HIV vaccine candidates launched. I think we just heard that we now have 5 candidates currently Some have already been launched, and some will be launched pretty soon. But also Linda talked about, the exciting, germline approaches, which again also offer a lot of promise in terms of moving forward with the field. So just getting back, to the issue of, drawing some lessons, despite, of course, the disappointing results that we have seen from the HIV vaccine research, we also know that, the HIV vaccine enterprise has been, some sort of like an engine, for discovery. You all agree with me that the HIV platform has actually helped produce a lot of, COVID vaccines. And this is why I think it's important for us, again, to reflect on how can we invest the same energy, the same approaches, the same strategy, the same coordination, and apply that into the HIV vaccine research. I mean, when you look at COVID vaccine discovery or development, for instance, there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from there. Of course, also taking cognizant of the fact that we know that HIV virus and the COVID virus, they are different in terms of the fact that with the COVID, with the SARS COVID-2 virus, it's actually easier to target. It can be an easier vaccine target, compared to HIV vaccine. But still, there are some lessons that we have learned in terms of we know that with increased funding, right, with increased resources, increased collaboration, increased coordination, it's possible for us, to compress the timelines in developing the new technologies and make sure that those are distributed within a short period of time. So again, I think as we enter this, what I call the new phase of HIV vaccine research, I think there are a few things that we need to take into consideration as we move forward with the field. I think first we need to consider the important role, which is my favorite. We need to consider the important role of communities. And by this, I mean, engaging communities as research partners, not just like as a source of trial participants, right? I think it's important for us to make sure that communities, we continue to engage communities from concept to trial design to implementation until delivery as well. We need to make sure that communities are engaged. We need to build trust with communities. I think we've heard a lot about, vaccine hesitancy, in Africa, but also it's not just in Africa. I think I would say globally, I think vaccine hesitancy, especially with COVID, has been an issue. So we need to make sure that we are building that trust early on, so that once we have an effective COVID vaccine, another HIV vaccine, vaccine hesitancy, shouldn't be an issue. I think for us as communities, we are eager to learn and listen with keen interest from researchers, from the industry, and from all the key stakeholders, leading the vaccine HIV research. And we are eager to learn the challenges, the struggles, and work together in a collaborative manner to find solutions to those challenges. I think as we move forward with the field, we'll definitely need fresh ideas, novel strategies, as you saw from Linda-Gail Bekker's presentation. I think now we need to accelerate even greater than before. And I think for us, to be able to accelerate, we actually need to test multiple HIV vaccine approaches and candidates at the same time, which is why I think the need for continued dialogue, coordination, information sharing, but also investment, increased investment cannot be overemphasized. I think allow me to jump the gun a little bit here and talk about vaccine distribution. So in my culture, actually, there's a famous saying which says, you don't start shelling the mice before you catch them. So anyway, in my culture, we eat mice. It may sound disgusting for others, but it's very delicious, actually. So I want to talk about, distribution because sometimes it's necessary to start planning ahead. I think there's something important that we have learned from the COVID vaccine distribution and how the lack of equity can delay our progress in fighting a pandemic. I think we saw how poor countries, or we've seen how poor countries have been left behind, whilst the rest of the world, has benefited from the success of the COVID vaccine discovery. And there's some important lessons, I think, for us to learn from this experience. Definitely, when we have, when we have an effective HIV vaccine, we need not to repeat the same the same mistakes, which is why I think it's important for us as we are moving into this new phase. We need to make sure that we are reflecting on this issue of equity in a more serious way. We need to make sure that as we're making decisions on trial design, locations, and plan follow-out, we must take equity into consideration. And last but not least, I think you saw from the presentation, Linda's presentation as well, that we still have, even though as we are moving into this phase, as we are talking about HIV vaccine, we know that we have other HIV prevention options that are available that have been approved, available on the market. And as we are moving forward with the vaccine research field, let's also not forget that we need to make sure that we are delivering the interventions that are available to those that need them. So let me stop there for now, Ntando, and hand over back to you. Thank you.
Maureen, thank you very much. That is lovely and has really given us a whole lot of homework for things to think about. And I think as a whole community in Africa in particular, but I think the field as well, as we continue to really press on with all of the feedback that Professor Linda-Gail Bekker has given us in terms of what is happening. And I think from both of you, we are hearing that the field is not giving up. We have had disappointments, but a whole lot more has really been learned and continues to strengthen the continuing search for an HIV vaccine, because it is what we need. And I think, Maureen, you then are highlighting that as part of this promising pipeline, there's a whole lot to think about in order for us to be ready for a day and a time when we find an HIV vaccine. So I think for some of the questions, again, we'd like to encourage you all to really send through your questions, and hopefully you are not shy to go on to unmute and ask any question to our great panelists today to really talk about this question and really highlighting the importance of working towards finding a vaccine and what it is that each of us has to do in order to get us there. So LGB, there is a question from, I think it is from, I can't find the question, but it is really asking about the 2 mRNAs that are currently going on in, I think in the country in particular. I will find the specific question. Yeah, it is from Flavia. Which are the 2 mRNA vaccine trials in Africa? Are they all in South Africa?
No. So very nice news that one is at the Orem site in South Africa and the other one is in Rwanda, which I think is very, very exciting. The study, I think it's going to be announced today. It's called IAVI G003. And as mentioned, the Immunogen, it's a tough set of letters, but just so people recognize, is EODGT860-MER. So that's the recombinant. These have been in the works for a little while, but now are going into the human clinical trials. And we're very glad that Africa is not being left behind in this regard. And I think it's really important that we continue to advocate, because what we don't want is the world to see, well, we have to come to Africa for the phase 3s and the big efficacy trials, but the experimental medicine, the phase 1s and 2s happen in Europe or in North America. We want to be part of the development all the way through. And so, I think we appreciate IAVI doing this and Scripps and their partners, the NIH involved. We also want to, participate all the way along. And so, I hope, the advocates will continue to push for that as well, even as we on the research side do.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, LGB. And we welcome those who are watching us live on the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation page. And please, anyone who is trying to join, because we couldn't be able to accommodate any more people, but thanks to technology, because our Facebook page will be keeping it there for anyone to go back as well and engage. LGB, there is a question that is $1 million question, and I think Maureen had touched on it a little bit about the difference or the reason why a COVID-19 vaccine was found in just under 2 years. And you have just shared with us years and years of an HIV vaccine and why that has not, I mean, we do not have it today.
Yeah, so you're right. It's more than $1 million. It's about tenfold more than we've spent on HIV vaccine R&D to date. So when we take TB and HIV and COVID, you can multiply by at least 10 in terms of the amount of money that's been spent in each of those buckets. And, you know, so that's the one, is incredible resources went into finding a COVID vaccine, really just extraordinary in terms of money. Secondly, expertise. Every single pharmaceutical, every academic lab, everybody came to the party for COVID-19 again. And then thirdly, we had structures in place thanks to HIV, and we had understanding in place thanks to HIV and all the other vaccinology that's gone on long before. Those of you who are interested in and sort of historical scholars, you might want to go and read, you know, how Barney Graham has been working on RSV for years, and that laid very much a platform for the mRNA vaccine that today is Moderna. You know, the collaborations across the countries has also played an extraordinary role. So all of these very important components, ingredients coming together, you know, on top of the fact that, yes, it is an easier pathogen. Maureen's right. It's not as tough a nut to crack as HIV is, but it really, you know, I think has been a modern day miracle to go from literally knowing what SARS-CoV-2 looked like genetically in probably January of 2020 to having an EUA for Pfizer, I think it was probably October, November of 2020, is mind-blowing. You know, and what we're asking is there is as much need, if not greater need. Remember, with COVID-19, although people, you know, can get sick, and we've seen terrible amounts of people dying, you know, I think America's just crossed the 1 million mark. That's tragic. People can recover from COVID. HIV is a lifelong situation. And so if we can prevent HIV in people, that is huge, huge, not only in terms of monetary cost, but also human cost. And so the need is great. We need that kind of commitment around the world from all kinds of stakeholders to, you know, to really get HIV going. And I won't even start on tuberculosis today, given that it's the HIV vaccine day.
No, thank you very much, LGB. And I think that's really encouraging all of us. Again, you know, about the trial, Adi has told us that we should stay tuned for the press release on IRVG 003 trial. It's happening later today. But if you check the chat box, you will see a statement by IRV on HVAD, on their HVAD statement. And Maureen, you have a question from Zonke. What further efforts do you think are still needed to create an effective coordinated approach from all stakeholders that you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. And I think I touched a bit on it, that I think we need information sharing. I think that we need a lot of like transparency, because I think when I mentioned about the stakeholders, you know, I'm talking about communities, I'm talking about the industry, pharmaceutical companies, the researchers, international NGOs. We were also talking about policymakers, regulatory bodies, funders. So it's all that included. And I think for us to achieve the level of coordination that is desired, for us to make progress in finding an HIV vaccine, an effective HIV vaccine, I think there will be need for us transparency, sharing information, making sure that all stakeholders are given an equal voice, I would say, especially when decisions are being made in terms of which candidates, for example, have to go into clinical trials, which locations, how do we allocate, which locations, do we allocate vaccine trials. I think you heard from Linda when she was talking about, how previously for experimental medicine trials, usually it used to be in European countries, but now we are seeing, that shift, and now the African continent will also be participating in that, which again speaks to the issue of, I think, capacity building, developing capacity on the African continent in terms of the infrastructure, which as advocates we've been pushing for, to say we would want to see, the field developing the level of, capacity in terms of infrastructure, but also even, capacity among our African researchers, I think, which we have seen over the years. So I think it will take a lot of just repeating information sharing, but also just having that open and honest dialogue among different stakeholders. And most of all, most importantly, working together and making sure that we all have a shared vision on why we need an HIV vaccine, and that all of us are geared towards making sure that yes, the reason why we need an HIV vaccine is not just because, it's not just because we want, it's for public healthy benefits at large, and not just because maybe we want to make profits. Sorry to use that word. Yeah, but just make sure that we all have a shared a vision and common understanding of why we need an HIV vaccine, and that we are all working towards achieving the same goal. So it's going to take a lot of working together, bridging, the gaps in terms of information, which most of the times, I think the reason why I said I'm always passionate about community engagement is because communities are always, left behind. You find that the other stakeholders are always moving ahead with decisions, and most of the times communities are not part of, conversations or forums where decisions are being made. Yeah, but I think recently we are seeing some changes, some improvements, I think, in the level of engagement among communities, which would want to see, to continue. So yeah, again, I think the private sector as well. I think in the past, we haven't seen a lot of private sector engagement, I would say, especially when we're having this conversation from concept to trial design, and as well as when you are planning for, what rollout is going to look like. I think there's been a disconnect in terms of making sure that even the private sector at large is also part of that conversation. So I think as we move into this new phase, I think it's important that all of us, we create more platforms which brings together, all relevant stakeholders in one place. So later, actually today, the IAS will be launching what they are calling the Global HIV Vaccine Enterprise Partnership, which tries to bring together all these different stakeholders, industry and non-industry partners, to really reflect on what can we learn from the field. What are the gaps, right? What are the challenges that we have faced? How do we move together? Just trying to create that platform where you bring all the different stakeholders and we reflect on the challenges that each of the stakeholders have faced, and then work together towards finding a solution. So we need more of those platforms that brings together different stakeholders so that we can all work together, think together, coordinate together, and move towards the same direction with a shared vision and mission.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Maureen. We need all of those platforms. And actually, speaking of platforms, please look at the chat box that the other AVAC webinar, it's about after an hour later when we end this current webinar. It's actually talking about platforms and pipelines in the HIV vaccine research. LGB, is there anything in research that's called failure, given all of what you shared with us in terms of what has happened? And I think John's question is around that. Now that we are talking about the new phase of HIV vaccine, is this an admission that there are the other phase, I'm not sure which other phase that is, has failed several years down the line?
So no, I actually don't think if a study is conducted well, so, you know, where I think research fails is when it is done poorly. In other words, if it's done unethically, that certainly is a terrible failure. If it's done unsafely, that's non-negotiable. But when it is conducted well, so that we get a clear and distinct answer, then that is far from a failure. So if you take 702, you know, the question was, could we replicate what happened in Thailand here in Southern Africa? And that study was really conducted to better than international standards. I mean, this is what our continent can deliver in extraordinary spades, are large trials with many individuals who willingly come to site, continue to be committed, and bring the results at the end. And we showed without doubt that that study did not work. When we say it did not work, the study worked because it showed us a result, but the candidate did not prevent HIV. The exact same for Imbokodo. It was a beautifully conducted study, extraordinary. It did not bring the results we had hoped. And so we now know that that isn't going to be sufficient in order to prevent HIV in women in Africa. We'll wait to see if it has implications for men who have sex with men. And then finally, the AMP study. That was just an amazing experiment. Just hundreds of thousands of those plastic, you know, infusion bottles went into arms, you know, around the world with an amazing retention rate, an amazing execution of the trial. At the end, what we learned was not only, you know, the conditions under which that could function, so that it has absolutely, you know, informed the antibody field going forward now, that we must match the antibody to the circulating virus. And if we can't do that, then we have to put a cocktail of antibodies in, a little bit like we do with antivirals, right? We don't just give people one single anti-HIV treatment. We give them a cocktail because we want to be sure we meet all kinds of opportunities. And that, you know, that really, you might say those 3 trials didn't bring the result we wanted, so they're failures. Far from it. They were brilliant success in telling us exactly what the next step needed to be. And so that really, I think, is what has set the HIV field aside, in that we are able to conduct extraordinary science that really is informative. And so I can pick up on that one question there that raised around, is it going to be multi-clade, multi-type vaccines? I do think we want to get a vaccine at the end of the day that is as broad in its application as possible. And, you know, ultimately, and that's sort of what the J&J program hoped to do. But ultimately, I think one other way of looking at this is we need a successful candidate, and then one can always work from there. So I think the hope is really to land on something that becomes a springboard to the next opportunities. I know there's naysayers, and Maureen's spoken about this on many forums. Can we compete against, say, a 6-monthly lenacapavir antiretroviral PrEP agent? Because maybe we're going to need vaccine doses that have to be given, you know, fairly frequently. So therefore, is there any point in wasting all this time? The point is, with the vaccine, you can start with one regimen, and then you can really build on it by adding adjuvants, by changing the immunogen. You can get to a point like, for example, now with tetanus, you only need a shot every 10 years. With polio, you only need it when you're a child, and then you're done. You know, that's the benefit and the value of a vaccine, and that's where we're headed. But there might be a journey to get there along the way. And indeed, it's been a 40-year one so far, but we are strong, we have girded our loins, we are ready to keep the fight going.
We are ready to keep the fight going. I think we'd like to, and I think as we reach the top of the hour, which really brings us to an end of this great session, and we hope everyone has really gotten something and has become motivated and encouraged to really identify where you can play a role. And I promise you, each and every one of us has a role to play in contributing towards an HIV vaccine. It's an effort that is not just for scientists, but it is for everyone. Communities, as Maureen has mentioned and highlighted. And I think at this point, as the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and advocates for prevention of HIV in Africa, I'd like to really thank all our partners, AVAC, the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, the South African Advocacy Coalition, the South African National AIDS Council, Africa Free of New HIV infections, and many other partners who have really made this possible. And it is through that partnership that we really are going to be able to do this work. And in closing, LGB and Maureen, I think a question number one, a question about the vaccine being accessed by people on treatment. And I think we can clarify that and talk about that. But overall, the question about this, which is what Maureen were referring to when talking about preparing, for global access and for success, so that we do not repeat, or at least we do not see any of the things that we have seen with regards to access to a product when it has been found through research. So I think that please give us closing remarks around ensuring that when a product has been tested, it has been found to be working, it is safe, access becomes a question. How do we address that?
I'll give that over to Maureen. That's a big one. And then maybe I'll pick up on the prevention versus therapy. Perfect. Maureen?
Yeah, so moving forward, I think in terms of access, I think like I mentioned earlier on, that I think we need to make sure it's important for us. I'll go back to the issue of equity. I think it's important for us to start reflecting on that now. And this is why I think it's even important for us to make sure that we are engaging all the relevant stakeholders earlier on, including policymakers at country level, so that once we have an effective HIV vaccine, it doesn't take even for us a long time for us. We don't delay in terms of like getting, for example, regulatory approval at country level, right? But also in terms of like making sure that countries' policymakers move forward with developing guidelines, with putting in place policies, but also again start planning well ahead in terms of like target setting, funding, but also putting the right infrastructure that will actually allow countries to deliver the vaccines to the people that need. So it's important to start planning ahead. But then speaking globally, I think it's important, especially for our rich countries, right? For well-resourced countries, I think to make sure that when decisions are being made in terms of how funding is located, I think they have equity in mind, right? It's not just about saving the rich countries first, and then like the poor countries always have to be the last, in the line. So it's important to make sure that I think we learned with COVID that access to COVID, COVID in Malawi, COVID in Africa, COVID in Malawi, it's COVID elsewhere, right? So we need to make sure that if we have that in mind and when we're planning for access and rollout, we take into consideration the fact that we need to make sure that access is available everywhere. And I think lastly, I think in terms of vaccine research, HIV vaccine research, I think I just wanted to end with the fact that we can't give up, which I said earlier on, we can't give up now. It's not yet over. Actually, we're just getting started, as you saw from Linda-Gail Bekker's slide. So the work is we still have a lot of work ahead of us. And this is only the beginning. And we need to put more energy and continue to press harder on the gas pedal.
Thank you. Right.
And I'd just quickly add that, we get on the coattails of COVID-19 around manufacturing. This is our continent coming into its own now to say we will be self-reliant. We will not continue to, go with begging bowls around the world. And so we're beginning to see that happen. So if you haven't caught up on the on the exciting news of mRNA hubs, what's happening there. We know we already have a COVID-19 mRNA vaccine lookalike being manufactured in a lab in South Africa. And I pay tribute to Petro to Blanche and her team, in that regard. So there's much that's going on, much to be proud of on our continent. And I do want to end with that to say, Ntando, it is not when we think about a world without AIDS, it's not Europe without AIDS or, Monaco without AIDS. It's a world without AIDS. And that really is very important. We will get there on this continent if we have a vaccine. We know we can do it with a vaccine. So really, really important to keep the fight going. We are talking about a preventive vaccine here. So it is for people not living with HIV. There is some work, and we haven't covered it today, to look at the role of therapeutic vaccines, particularly in the field of cure research. And there is work being done also in monoclonal antibodies in that space. So maybe the subject of another webinar on another day. But thank you for putting this together. And it was a real pleasure to share the platform with you, Maureen. And I look forward to keeping the journey going with all the people who've joined us on the webinar today.
Thank you very much. And I think we have our virtual hands to really give to this power couple who are actually getting onto another webinar, which I think is really great. But thank you very much to all of you. We continue with the fight and we continue with the search to find an HIV vaccine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.